Hello, my History 157 students. This is Professor Donald Earl Collins. It is now week 6. We are headed down the home stretch of the course. Yay! We will be done in less than 3 weeks with this course, which will give me my first real vacation from teaching in basically 4 years, and more importantly for you all, break from me and a grade for the course, and moving on to whatever else you're doing for the remainder of summer and for the following fall. Or if graduating, congratulations in those cases. So anyway, talk to you a little bit about the week 5 discussion because it's kind of important, a few things I have to say about it, and to talk about week 6 in detail. In general, I will say that it is fairly obvious from what I saw regarding week 5 and from what I've seen the last couple of weeks that a good portion of you are not doing the OER readings, the free textbook provided, OpenStax textbook provided by UMGC for the course. Nor are you, for the most part, watching the videos like the one I am doing today. Probably because you think 20 to 25 minutes is too long to cover, a huge chunk of U.S. history that would normally be covered in the 2.5 hour lecture, of which would be probably, 2.5 hour lecture a week, of which I would actually lecture probably an hour and 15, an hour and 20 minutes per class, maybe a little bit more than that. Because of the answers I'm seeing. Um, I put in the answer in FDR, talk about the relationship to FDR and ordinary American people should have been a hint in fireside chats, and talk about particularly New Deal programs that came online after 1935 and what's known as the Second New Deal, particularly the Social Security Act of 1935. So it really doesn't matter if your opinion is that the Labor Standards Act is the most important piece of legislation, when employing the fact the Social Security Act of 1935 has meant that basically tens, if not hundreds of millions of people over the last, say, 90 years, 85, 90 years, have benefited from that relationship with the federal government in that, their workers' comp, their unemployment, aid the families or the mothers of dependent children, disabilities, death benefits, retirement for people who are too old to be working, all became part of America's social safety network by the mid 1930s and the late 1930s. The Labor Standards Act, which provides things like an 8-hour work week and a minimum wage and things of that nature, that's important, but you know, on the scale of things, a big social security network, a social safety net for people who consistently were falling through the cracks even before the Great Depression, that's a humongous shift. I don't understand how this could be anything other than the most important piece of legislation passed under FDR. It's not even an opinion thing. It's not even debatable. Any historian who studies this period would bring this up front and center as part of the Second New Deal. The other stuff's important. I'm not arguing that the WPA isn't important. I'm not arguing some of the other stuff that comes out of this is important. But talking about the first 100 days in banking and getting the economy going, when anywhere between 25 to 33% of the population's unemployed, where millions have malnourished and or starved on some level. People have had divorces. There have been lots of murder, suicides, crime rates way up. Domestic abuse, domestic violence is way up. General violence is way up. Right? People are moving to try to find working places where there isn't any work. Right? Okies and all of that. All this stuff's going on, but the most important piece of legislation is the FDIC, to closing the banks for 100 days. That's important. I'm not saying it's unimportant, but it doesn't change the relationship between the federal government and ordinary Americans, not corporations, not people who had up to $100,000 that they needed to have insured, but the American people, ordinary people. And on that count and on the Roaring Twenties, as a class, y'all, generally speaking, were so hyper focused on the rote memorization of whatever you learned about these periods from your high school textbook or your high school teacher, or your middle school teacher, or the American Heroes Channel, or the Smithsonian America in Color programs, or whatever, that you weren't paying attention to your textbook, and you sure as heck weren't paying attention to me when I was correcting you. Apparently, I don't know anything as your professor in this particular case. So, I need y'all to do a better job of reading the textbook. I need y'all to do a better job of at least listening to what I have to say in terms of saying, hey, the textbook doesn't cover certain things. Here's what I have to say about it. Hey, this trope here in the media is X. You need to ignore that trope if you really want to understand more deeply what's actually happening in this period. After all, isn't this the goal? To learn, not just get an A or try to get as close to an A as possible, to try to learn some stuff along the way too. Maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe the point of a college education is just to have a piece of paper so you can get a better job. Maybe I'm completely wrong about that. But as a historian, as someone who's worked in this field for 30 years, I think it's kind of important to learn this material and to understand that not everything that the media puts out about this period or that we watch from some, random program should trump what someone, what a detailed textbook like the one you actually have in this particular case is actually pretty good. It has holes in it, but it's pretty good compared to a lot of other things that are out there. And someone who's worked in the field for 30 years might have to say about this stuff. So anyway, you guys need to pick it up a few notches, is all I'm saying. Okay, let me try to be as brief as possible about week 6 because we still have the post-World War II period, the Civil Rights Movement period of the 70s, 80s, 90s, and zeros to cover. And unfortunately, the way they've reconstructed this course, the details of the period after 1970 get even fuzzier now, the way they have it constructed versus the way it was constructed when I was teaching this course more regularly between, say, 2009 and 2017. So anyway, World War II and the period immediately after World War II. This is when America truly becomes great, right? We become a superpower. We have access to atomic energy and the atom bomb. We win. We are the reason why World War II gets won. There's no doubt. It's not like World War I. We just come in late and we just provide enough numbers so that the European powers can win this war, kind of thing, right? Out and out, we are leading the free world and winning World War II, both in the Pacific and in East Asia and in Southeast Asia, in Northern Africa, in Western Europe, and so on and so forth. Except that doesn't completely account for the fact that the Soviet Union absorbed the biggest hit that anyone took from Nazi Germany during the war and absorbed it for 3.5 years, right? Partly their fault. Stalin should have been prepared, etc., etc., etc. But the truth of the matter is, without the Soviet Union taking such a humongous hit from the bulk of Nazi Germany and its fascist supporters, Romania, Italy, etc., during 1941, 42, and 43. That allowed us to build up forces, allowed the U.S. to build up its forces to fight in Western Europe without having to take on, 5 million Germans and Romanians and other groups from Central and Eastern Europe supporting Nazi Germany's efforts to conquer Eastern Europe. If that happened in the West, it would have been a much tougher fight. Let's just be honest. Still, Germans are fighting mostly, they have mechanized forces, they have panzers, they use them very well, etc., etc., etc. But by the time you were fighting the Germans, they don't have lots of panzers. Their soldiers are still, marching on foot or riding horses, right? And we're making tanks, we're making planes, we have a truly mechanized army because of our industrial might, because of U.S. industrial might, because of U.S. ability to mass manufacture all kinds of stuff. We didn't make the best tanks. The Soviets made the best tanks, the T-34s, right? But we supported them with food because, in point of fact, the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, the Ukraine, was under German control in 1941, 42, and in 43, right? And parts of it well into the first half of 44. So the truth of the matter is that we helped. We definitely helped the Soviet Union in terms of its ability to wage war. But they absorbed all of the best that not the German army could hit them with before we were fully engaged in supplying them anyway. So you gotta tip your hat to them. If you don't, if not from the ideological perspective of communism and capitalism or democracy and totalitarianism, certainly from the perspective of the people, right? They fought, right? It wasn't whether or not you agree with whatever ideology they have or Stalin. The fact of the matter is, it took the Soviet people fought and fought hard to push Germany out of their country. They fought a battle, a great patriotic war is what it's called there. And it was a great patriotic war. Whatever else you might think, it was. 27 million, 30 million Russians, Ukrainians, etc., 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 died as a result of fighting them. 30 million people. 3/8 of all the people who died in World War II died, on the Eastern Front in Russia, and Ukraine and Belarus and all across that part of Eastern Europe. So in that sense, seeing the U.S. as the last man standing is completely erroneous, right? In that sense, there is a second superpower that comes out of World War II, and it is the Soviet Union. They might not have nuclear weapons or the ability to build one fully until 1949, thanks to them stealing our methodologies from Los Alamos and other places, but true, because of their spying, which leads to the part of which leads to the Red Scare and McCarthyism in the late 1940s and 1950s, which we'll get to. But the truth of the matter is that 50,000 T-34 tanks and a 6 million man army at the end of World War II is a lot to look at. They did not draw down their forces at the end of World War II. They used those forces to basically occupy almost all of Eastern Europe, right? To form what we call the Iron Curtain, soon to be called the Warsaw Pact by the 1950s. So Poland and Czechoslovakia, Eastern Germany, one of the four occupied zones at the end of the war, and so on and so forth. So this period of time is how the U.S. is basically the U.S. stepping up to the plate as a world power, ending its isolationism, and becoming the superpower that it should have become after World War I. So that's part of what's going on, right? And fighting the war in Europe, fighting the war in the Pacific, fighting against Japan, finding, providing foodstuffs and materials and other materials and materials, war material for China and the British Empire and wherever the French were fighting for freedom and other groups. That's part of all of that. But in order to understand this more fully, and I don't have time to go into every detail, part of what you need to understand is how we got to World War II in the first place. The Great Depression is one of the causes, because the Great Depression and World War One, how in World War One ended, basically leaving Germany holding the bag of the blame for a war that they did not actually start. Technically speaking, they all are at fault. All the European powers are at fault. And so part of what FDR envisions, even as this war is ramping up in 1939 and 1940 and 1941, is at the end of the war having a third party location where you can work out disputes so that there are no more world wars. But more importantly, having a place where if objectively you can sit down and say, hey, this thing is to blame or that thing is to blame. Having a world where people are trading, right? That you have international trade going on. So no one country is just dependent on their own economy in order to prop up profitability, prop up prosperity, to prop people up, through high tariffs and, corporate welfare and so on and so forth. We still have plenty of corporate welfare to be sure, but it's more international now. It's not just one country doing it for its own economy kind of thing, right? Getting rid of fascism and all of that. That's where the United Nations comes in for all of it. So, and even though Stalin was not a big fan of the United Nations and saw it as BS and saw them as potentially meddling in Soviet affairs, he also realized that Soviet Union needs to be a part of this. If you really want to be a superpower and put your stamp on the rest of the world, you can't just simply go, "No, I'm not going to be. We're not going to be part of UN." So the Soviet Union's part of that part too. So you have to understand there are two superpowers at the end of World War II, not one. So when I teach this course, I do not talk about the battles of World War II for the most part. I don't, when I do a full lecture, I might bring up a battle here or a battle there. But this is not a military course. This is not military history. This is social history of people and what people went through during and after a war, right? Whether you're talking about the total war that led to the deaths of millions of civilians, and not only in Eastern Europe, but also in Japan, and also in Germany, and also in Italy, and in France, and the hundreds of thousands of people who died, you know, well, not hundreds of thousands, but tens of thousands of people who died during the Blitz in London in 1940 and 41, right? There's 400,000 Americans who died during World War II, including the 2,400 that died during on Pearl Harbor Day on December 1st, 1941, right? That's all part of that. But also the home front battles. Whether you're talking about Executive Order 8802, which basically said that defense industry companies that had contracts with the federal government to make weapons, to make things for the military during World War II, to make materiel, could not exclude people on the basis of race or creed or color, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And the March on Washington movement led by A. Philip Randolph that basically got stopped before it started because FDR wrote down Executive Order 8802 to protect for the first time, the rights of African Americans and other people of color to work in these factories that are making weapons to supply folks during the war. The days, their meatless days, the sugarless days, the coffeeless days, so that we could basically, as a country, supply the 16.5 million troops who are fighting overseas and guarding bases at home, right? Women that became part of the military as a result of World War II. The 6.5 to 7 million women, mostly white, because a lot of black women were working, a lot of white immigrant women were working, a lot of poor white women were working prior to the start of World War II. It's the Depression period, after all. Everyone needed to work to some extent, right? So middle-class white women are the big group that goes to work for the first time in large numbers during World War II. So when you talk about Rosie the Riveter and that image is, well, it's an image, it's a caricature, right? So there's that. But also, there's also Executive Order 9066, the one that puts Japanese Americans, mostly citizens, because they're second, third, and fourth generation citizens we're talking about here, in internment camps throughout the western United States, Arizona and Utah and Nevada and New Mexico and other places, who lose their businesses, lose their homes, because they're all seized by the federal government. They're seized by individual people, because of anti-Asian sentiment. I'm pretty sure you're pretty familiar with the notion of anti-Asian sentiments in this country, anti-Asian racism. That's also signed as an executive order after Pearl Harbor in this particular case by FDR, right? It took the Supreme Court decision, Korematsu decision in 1944 or 45 to finally declare that what the federal government did was unconstitutional, not to mention racist, and eventually by 1989, 88 and 89, under the Reagan administration, beginning the Bush administration, we paid these folks something like $20 billion in reparations for what? Or I forget, it's billion or million, I can't remember. Reparations for ruining their lives for 4 or 5 or 6 years, taking their lands, taking whatever else that they had. Right, so it's not all good. It's not all good. The Zoot Suit riots that are happening, which historians declare as textbooks say is one event in 1943, but according to the actual people who lived through the Zoot Suit riots in East LA and other parts of the LA SoCal region, the Latinx people who had to deal with it. They're the ones who say that these kinds of things went on off and on for 2 or 3 years, right? In this case, anti-Mexican sentiments, what we call anti-Chicano sentiments in this case, right? Racism. There's the Port Arthur situation outside of Seattle, Washington in 1944, where a ship full of of munitions blows up and kills over 260 African American sailors and stevedores who are loading up ships because their conditions are unsafe, and the folks who are managing, the white folks who are managing, don't really give a crap that they're working in unsafe conditions with deadly weapons, right? So while there is a general united front that says that the U.S. is supposed to help out, the U.S. is supposed to be an arsenal for democracy, supposed to be the leader of the free world, is supposed to fight fascism and Nazism and racism, anti-Jewish, anti-black, whatever kind of racism, going on abroad. It's got issues at home. And two things can be true at once. You can have a united front on the one hand for all of these things and fight a war, whether you are African American, white, female, male, etc., 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 while at the same time oppress people. So both can be true. But we come out on the other side, the superpower. And despite the worries that the post-World War II economy would tank like it did in World War One, it did not. And part of the reason it did not is because the U.S. made the decision to be part of the UN, to be part of the Bretton Woods negotiation, and to build a new economic world order, its own form of an empire, whereby folks, whereby FDR's New Deal or Fair Deal or the new version of his New Deal, which he talks about in 1944 and then in 1945, talking about an economic bill of rights, in the last few months before he dies in April 12th of 1945, whereby you create the American middle class that had up to this point hadn't really existed. Maybe 15-20% of the population's in the middle class. But between 1945, because of unionization, because of the social welfare network, because of rising tide lifts all boats approach to economics, American middle class becomes 60% of the country in a matter of a generation during and after World War II. That happens, and it's a result of things like free trade agreements, working with the rest of Europe to rebuild Europe. People are like, why should we have spent money rebuilding Europe? That Marshall Plan, that $17 billion investment, which would be worth about, I don't know, maybe $100 billion in today's money, versus the trillions upon trillions of dollars the U.S. and the companies, big companies in the U.S. made as a result of all of that. But yeah, let's not invest in rebuilding Europe so that we can have a third world war and use nuclear weapons instead. Yeah, sounds like a great idea. The Marshall Plan to help rebuild Japan. We needed trading partners. You can't have a growing economy without trading partners. It did help, by the way, that at the end of World War II, the U.S. was 52% of the world's GDP. It was 52% of the world's economy at the end of World War II, right? That's another aspect of the superpower thing that folks don't think about. We always talk about the military and nuclear weapons and all those other things, but having enough output to, outproduce the entire rest of the world, 52 to 48, right, meant that the U.S. could dictate terms favorable to its economy, vis-a-vis Europe, vis-a-vis Japan, vis-a-vis East Asia, vis-a-vis other parts of the world, the new countries that are, nation states that are coming out of sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and other parts of the world too. And that helps prop up the U.S. economy, not just as being the number one economy in the world, technically it still is today, but being the predominant economy in the world. There was never, that's what's happening in this period. And that's, this is sort of the height of Pax Americana, Pax Americana, the American century, right? The American century that basically starts with our entry into World War II in 1941 and ends roughly when I'm a toddler, around 1973-74. So, and obviously I'm not a toddler anymore. So it's something to think about as we continue to talk about U.S. history. Hopefully, y'all will watch this week.